Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. I don't know whether this is the good session or the bad session after everyone's eaten in a very warm auditorium. But I'm sure we'll get through the 300 slides that I've got to get through in the next 20, 25 minutes. So I thought in this session, to focus on devices, it's really good to understand the context of the environments we want to use the devices, and also some of the use cases and some of the considerations that have to be put forward for them. So at Lawo, we clearly identify three areas of significant importance for the deployment and enablement of IP in this broadcast space. First one is studio and playout infrastructure. This is, as you alluded to several times this morning, these are your new greenfield sites. These are sites where customers want to put on additional studios to existing studios and leverage some of the IP technology, or want to connect trucks to studios, again, to provide extra resource. We also see a big drive in IP and outside broadcasting, and what I would say there, it's really around a couple of things. First one is around UHD production, so taking a traditional HD truck, providing the same level of connectivity, but in a UHD, and then also providing HDR and SDR layers, and it really only becomes feasible when you start looking at IP technology to enable that. The third one, and the one that I think is probably the one the most talked about subject today, which is remote production and providing new workflows, connectivity of islands, providing new ways of working, covering more content, more for less, I guess, is kind of the phrase there. The nice thing with the NEP discussion we've been having today is they actually cover all of those. So it's very rare that you get a customer that's doing all three. They normally have a very clear business driver for one or the other. But if you think about the studios, and we're talking mainly about the hubs in Sydney, Melbourne, and when we're talking about the venues, it's the connectivity, whether it be IP trucks or whether it's legacy trucks with IP connectivity through the forms of some sort of fly pack. So, and this was also alluded to this morning in terms of distance, and I think the real message here is when you can achieve the type of connectivity and the functionality of these sort of distances, it gives you really a hope that we can expand it beyond that and go to sort of subcontinent connectivity at some point in the future. In terms of the kind of distance, 450 miles between the hubs, and the furthest venue from a hub is just over 2,000 miles. As discussed, the things that you would take for granted, but I'll point them out. There's diverse path protection, so if one of the red or blue network gets severed, there is a diverse path for it. Hubs are connected from 10 all the way up to 300, depending on requirements. And the venues are typically 50 gig, and some of the remote venues connected on 10 gig, but that's only a very small percentage. And just to kind of do the reverse of Paul's slide this morning, to give you the context of the size of the UK in the grand schemes, it's a very small piece of it, so approximately 31 times the size of the UK. So choosing the equipment, you think that'd be easy. You can just go to a vendor's website, download the latest brochures and data sheets, kind of choose the best ones that sound good, and then kind of build a product or a solution from that. Well, unfortunately, it's not quite that easy. So these are kind of the areas I'm going to cover: devices and the selection dilemma around devices, the audio, and that's been discussed a few times this morning around flows and workflows with audio. Timing, again, to reiterate some of the points from some of the presenters this morning. Connectivity, how do we manage the connectivity inside the network so we make sure we get the reliability, the redundancy, and also the signals to the right place. And then I'm going to touch a little bit on the control and why the control side of it is really important to provide the kind of unified layer without providing any sort of ramifications to its implementation. So let's start with the devices. The cameras are really easy. Most of the camera vendors today, and certainly we have at NEP with Sony, they provide access to all of the I/O that you would expect. So that is clean and dirty outputs, that's camera returns. If it's got some sort of processing in HDR, SDR output, you get access to that on the IP fabric. And generally, you can get now the IP audio into the intercom to that as well. That was not the case if you were to go back 12, 18 months ago, where some of the signals were on the IP layer, and then you needed to wrap additional gateways around it to get the additional signals into the IP fabric. Production switcher I think, is also massively evolved. So where we were seeing production switcher vendors with mixtures of SDI and IP/I/O, which provided lots of challenges around different timing planes, now we're seeing really with the introduction of the Sony switcher, big, large pipes to the production switcher, get a lot of signals aggregated into there. But there are some things you have to think about, like the timing window, re-entries around MEs, and also, do you want to do clean switching? So what does that mean? Flows that are pre-subscribed to the switcher are naturally clean, but you may want flows that are not currently pre-subscribed in the switcher to be on an ME bus, so therefore you have to go and get it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Replay servers, EVS is very strong in this place. IP implementations today are generally based on multiple 10 gig interfacing. That provides some challenges when we start talking around super slow motion and UHD. And we get into this concept of grouped SDPs. So an SDP is a bit of data which tells receivers about the senders. And in this case, we got multiple senders that constitute the picture with multiple flows, so we have to refer to them in a single grouped SDP. That in itself provides some challenges in devices as well. And again, there is a requirement to do upstream switching where you may want to change the sources into the replay server to be able to record it. Multi-viewers, and again, I think there's lots of different ways you can address this. There's traditional multi-viewers, SDI to IP. In reality, the most economic way is to put an IP multi-viewer in the network, subscribe flows to it, create the mosaics, and then put the IP mosaic back into the network. And there's a few ways of doing that, whether it's distributed multi-viewer or your traditional multi-viewer. The latency is quite important. So when we talk about this type of use case of live production, latency is super important in terms of the overall propagation delay in the system. And there may be also a requirement to have compressed streams inside that networks, which again brings a lot of challenges in that area. Migration to UHD, and this is the one where we see probably some of the biggest challenges or misunderstandings of the technology. Putting UHD into the IP network is not hard if you're going to just do 4 times 3 gig, but does bring some issues around timing, making sure the sources are all putting at exactly the same time. So when we bring them back out the other side, we can align them atomically to make sure we don't get any sort of crosshairs or pixel offsets in there. If you're doing 12 gig SDI, so single input, it may be desired that you want to be single raster throughout the network. What is the implication of that versus quads? Do our devices have to support both? How do they handle both? And if I'm doing square division instead of 2SI, I maybe have then maybe at least a frame of delay or possibly 2 frames of delay in the system, and what are the implications of that? So these are really, I would say if you're looking at building a live production system, you're going to have all of these in there. These are all valid points when you come down to choosing these types of devices. The one I want to focus on, and the one that has a lot of the attention, which is around the infrastructure, how we get signals in and out of it, whether it's IP to IP, whether it's SDI to IP, IP to SDI. And there are effectively these things called gateways, but there are 3 different types of classes of gateways. So you have your basic gateway, which is generally built for price or for power or for noise reasons, and it's just a simple way of getting back out of IP into SDI or HDMI to put it onto a monitor. It does provide some challenges when we're driven by cost or power or cooling. It may be that you put the hardware that goes in the product is not necessarily the same as what we put in some of the larger products. So some of the functionality is either skipped or not possible. So what does that mean? It means that you've most likely got a low signal density per port, so you might burn some bandwidth on the network port. But it also means things like, and -7, it was alluded to this morning on the purple networking, how do I have a single-ended device that straddles both sides of the network? What do I do about jitter? So if it has very little memory inside of it, how does it deal with jitter in the network? How do I do AV alignment, so RTP, timestamp alignment, when I want to correlate both audio and video together, and do jitter alignment, and do the buffering for the -7 at the same time? And then what if I've got some sources that are unlocked, or I've got audio that needs to be reclocked, sample rate converted? Again, these all use valuable resources that are generally inside of that gateway device. So basic gateways, I think, are required. They're typically the devices that you throw down behind monitor stacks. They're devices that you normally need to just get a signal out of the IP domain. We see then enhanced gateways, and this is where you get more connectivity. Typically, these are 25 or 40 gig I/O capable. They straddle both 3 gig and 12 gig I/O, and you get multiple encapsulation and decapsulation. So that means there's normally 8 or 10 inputs or 8 and 10 outputs, and they're normally bidirectional, and they can provide that functionality for you. And they generally have some level of memory handling to deal with things like the -7, diverse buffer, things like jitter protection, things like AV alignment, frame sync, and sample rate conversion. And they probably provide a certain amount of it, but when you get beyond that, or the distance is too great, or the jitter is too much, then you find that actually you've either got to reduce the I/O count, or you've got to look at something else. And then we see this introduction of what we call reprogrammable gateways. So I think customers today know they have to do some form of conversion, but what they want to make sure is that the devices beyond the conversion stage, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, can be reused for other things. And in this case, these are typically devices which are more expensive up front, but they have larger FPGAs, so more grunt, more processing. They can do more things, multi-viewing, up-down cross-conversion, color correction, HDR processing, and they can do the traditional gateway handling as well. And in this case, you generally find they've got a lot of memory on them. So whether it's high bandwidth memory on the FPGA or it's external memory sat alongside it. So they can accommodate very large, diverse paths in -7, a lot of jitter. They can do full AV alignment. They've got a lot of memory available for the frame sync and also for sample rate conversion. So when you're going to the market and you're looking at different vendors for gateways, yes, you'll get a lot of different data sheets that will give you a very wide view on it, but it's really good to understand it. It's not just about the costs from SDI to IP. It's also about whether it does some of these other handling, and that's really important. Because the system that you build will unfortunately force you probably into some of these areas. So if we look at it like that, we look at the kind of NEP, we've got cameras that are connected to switches, red and blue. We've got some audio that's connected to red and blue. It effectively gets piped through a telco network, which may introduce some jitter, into 2 very large switches. They then connect to a block of resource processing, whether it's replay servers, switcher, multi-viewers, traditional processing, and then the signals have to be handled for -7. Maybe they need to be frame synchronized if there's some timing variation, or the sources in themselves are not locked. There may be jitter because we've gone through somebody else's network to get to the device, and there's most likely going to need to be some sort of AV alignment at some point as well. And then we get to the far side, the bit where we present it out of the system. So you may decide that your monitoring area doesn't need to be redundant, so you stick that monitoring device on one side of the network, but it has to have some level of that functionality. If the flows hit the processing block before, you can deal with it. But in the event that the flows don't hit that block and they go straight to that monitor, you're going to expect some of that functionality at the far side. And likewise, if you're doing program and preview output. So again, in this case, anything can go to that output. So it could be a TX line, so you need to make sure you can accommodate all those scenarios. And in terms of timing planes and time of flight, generally the flows through switches are nanosecond time through the switches. A millisecond through the network, could be greater depending on the network provider. You effectively have a timing plane at some point where you need to align stuff, and then beyond that, you've again got transit time as it comes back out of the switch. So if I look at the kind of uncompressed approach, we put in 211030 and 31, we put in the video, and today what we see is for the audio, it's level A, and I'm going to come on to that while I bring some challenges. 20 uncompressed video, and generally there's an expectation that a video sender is a narrow sender and a wide receiver, so it can accommodate a lot of handling, and it can also make sure it's a well-behaved citizen in the network. What does it look like if we're doing compression? Because the telco network has bandwidth limitations. In this case, it's a kind of similar model, but we put into it the same audio. But in this case, you address the compression as and when required. So at one side, you stay 2110 essence-based, where you need the low latency and the handling. You use compression for the transit through the network, telco network, and then again, you try and normalize it back into 2110 inside the main facility in order to, again, keep down the overall cost in the system. And again, some of the parameters don't change in terms of 30 and 31 for level A and 211020. And VC2, which is compression you've heard a lot about today, it's one of the only standards-based compression, and it's currently going through a process of becoming part of 211022. So seamless protections, I think it's good to just point this out because people get a little bit lost in this. But this is, when we talk about does IP provide more resilience or less resilience than SDI in a traditional plant, arguably it provides more. So when you look at a device that transmits in both networks, the packet gets put in both physical networks. Both networks are active. The receiver will take the packet from both networks, put it into its buffer, and then choose which one it wants to then put into its output in order to generate the picture. So in terms of context of an SDI redundancy path, this would be camera, DA, 2 routers, back into a changeover unit, back into the output device. And with a -7 system, you get that by nature on every single endpoint. And I would say that's not entirely true of an SDI facility. It does bring some challenges when you start looking at remote production. So your red and blue paths, or your protected path, is not always going to be the same time or the same distance. So you end up with this path differential. And in order to protect them, you have to make sure that the buffer at the receiving side has sufficient memory and buffer to be able to accommodate to protect that. And again, this is where it gets important on the device that you choose, because the device that you choose may not meet all the class requirements for every application. So in order to protect, we would say you've got a couple of options. In remote production, you most likely want to be class B, which provides up to 50 milliseconds of protection in the event that your red and blue network are very diverse. And then inside your facility, so where your sender is originated inside your facility and the receiver is inside the same facility, you may want to make sure you've got class D, which is a low latency. Unfortunately, there's a real mix match of support of this in the industry. So you'll find mainly first generation products are supporting class D, which means your protection is really on the pinhead. So once you start getting through multiple switch hop or outside the facility, you're going to find providing a level of protection is going to be quite challenging. You may also decide that you don't need -7 everywhere. And we see customers, and certainly in NEP Australia, there are non-critical parts of monitoring walls where they just decide they don't need the protection, so they put the device on one side of it. Clean switching modes, I think these are well known. There are 2 modes. There's break before make, where we have the device receive the flow, and when it wants to jump to the next flow, it lets the flow go, holds it in memory, and at the next vertical interval, top of frame, it'll then switch in the next flow. No additional bandwidth required. It's always clean, but if you had the same source, you would obviously see some sort of freeze impairment between the sources. The other alternative is to do make before break, where we pre-subscribe the flow before we switch to it, but it means that you have to have an architecture which allows for double bandwidth for that very short period of time. And there are some tricks you can do in this area where we can jump onto the redundant network to do this, but then it really defeats the object of redundancy if you're going to impact your redundancy in order to do this. Why is this important for devices? So let's think about the production switcher as a use case. I may have sources on the switcher which are pre-subscribed. So I have a very large switcher frame. I have all my inputs. All the flows are pre-subscribed on the frame. I run down the bus, and I switch them all in. They're all there. They're all clean. What happens when I want to switch upstream to take another source that isn't pre-subscribed? Well, the switch time for that is going to be slightly different. So if it has to make an IGMP request, it has to get the flow, then put the flow on the device, has to then be timed, put onto the crossbar. You may find that's going to take 50 milliseconds. That's going to feel slightly different when you come to switch. What if, though, the source is right at the far side, and I have to bring it through the network in order to get it? Again, it's going to increase your switch time to be able to bring it in. So these are all things that you should be aware of when designing a system. And there are different ways to do it. We have some customers that just want to pre-subscribe everything. So everything is on the production switcher, because the production switcher's got lots of I/O. It's got a big 100 gig pipes, lots of MEs. It's fine. But then we have customers that want to use a smaller switcher for size reasons, for a truck, for a fly pack, and only want to have enough sources pre-subscribed for the number of MEs. And then you can do the upstream switching, but you need to be aware of what some of the implications are of that. So just kind of in kind of considerations for these, I'll kind of run through these. AV RTP timestamp alignment. Don't take it as given that every vendor supports the RTP timestamp alignment. Some vendors don't, which means that there could be some manual timing required. Your sender performance, you heard Jared talk about this. Unbehaved senders can cause all sorts of problems in the network. Never mind the switches, but also the receivers that haven't got a mechanism to handle with it. There's probably going to be some sort of frame synchronization or sample rate conversion, whether you're coming from RF cameras, off-air boxes that aren't locked, or whether you're coming from Dante networks into 2110 or A67 networks, where there are some different timing planes and some sample rate conversion required. Compression, don't just spray it everywhere. It's expensive. There will be some sort of license cost. even if it's for free from a license perspective, it costs the device because the device needs more processing in order to be able to handle it, and ultimately it adds in delay throughout the system as well. And the last one is just some kind of simple things. How do the devices behave when the flow that you want is already in the device? And some devices miraculously don't have a handling for local loop, so you can't transmit a multicast to a switch and ask for the same multicast back that you just gave it. It doesn't work. So some devices don't do a local loop, which means it becomes a bit challenging then getting an input into an output on it. And the other way to do that would be to have a simple AV internal matrix. And again, not all devices have that either. So let's talk about audio. We have these audio workflows. One of the things that was talked about this morning was this remote audio mixing. The reason this is done is because at the locations we have presenters on headsets, it's important not to burden them with a 50+ millisecond round trip. So what we have deployed at NEP in Australia is that the mixing desk is in the hubs, but it's actually driving an audio processor at the remote site to do a local mix for the local presenters. So we only burden them with that delay rather than the complete round trip delay. So think of it as running in sync. As you're running the faders in the hub, you'll see that actually the processing core inside the truck is driven remotely. So then we get on to how do devices handle audio. So we have this concept of multiple levels and multiple receivers. So some devices can receive a single video and a single audio. Some, if you're lucky, can receive 2 audio. Very few of them can receive 3 or 4 audio. So when I've got lots of flows in my network, and I'm used to having a mono audio matrix, and I want to pick off mono tracks from lots of different sources, it becomes a bit challenging. So there's a couple of ways you can address this. The first one is you can just shove down a core, and we can essentially create a mixing core, and we can subscribe everything to it. Lots of IP flows coming in, lots of a very large mono matrix. We can create packages, then the packages can then either be processed and they can be outputted back to the receive side. And that's one way of doing it, and that's quite a common way of doing it, and some of the deployments talked about today do it in this way. Another way to do it is to actually give the endpoint or the receiver or the gateway some additional functionality to handle this by using either tagging at the source side to identify individual mono tracks within inside a flow, and also create trunks. So instead of packaging everything as 2 channels, we can group them all up as up to 64 and route them to the receiver side. And then on the receiver side, we have lots of audio receivers, a full matrix and a full shuffler. And at this point, based on the tagging, you can then reconstitute your output. And it does, there's no right or wrong way of doing this. It just depends on the type of workflow that you want to do it. And again, when I talked about the basic gateway devices, this is normally something you'd expect from the kind of advanced gateway functionality. So these are the levels that you should be aware of. Level A is the one which is the mandatory one, which is where most of the challenges lie, if I'm honest. But actually, if you want to follow the trunk approach or you want to deal with MADI, you're going to find that you're going to be using level C, which is not as well supported across every device vendor. And that's to provide 125 microseconds with more than 8 channels of audio. But the most important thing, when you talk about devices, on that data sheet again, is the numbers of receivers. That's the limitation. And that will ultimately drive you down a path of what your audio workflow is going to look like. So audio considerations are local versus remote mixing. What's the impact of that? Dealing with the delay if you've got presenters at the remote site versus at a studio side. Are you going to build convergence? So are you going to have your intercoms and everything on the same media network? How are you going to deal with Dante? That was one thing this morning. Do you put a bridge device, which is Dante one side and 2110 the other, and we sample rate conversion as it goes through? It's one way of doing it. What about these mandatory levels? What about things like MADI? How do I deal with MADI? Receiver limitations, and then sample rate conversion. Again, how do I deal with unlocked sources and different timing planes? So timing PTP architecture is really, I think, one of the most critical, and I would echo what both Daniel and Gerald said here is, if this isn't built properly, the whole thing doesn't work. The senders are dependent on PTP. The receivers are also dependent on the PTP for the alignment. So there are a number of ways you can decide to do it from one side and transit the PTP through the network, and I think Daniel alluded to that. The challenge you have here is reliability, jitter, managing PTP traffic through a network that maybe you have zero control over. And that's, I think it's fine if you're doing it on your own network and you're doing it in short proximity. When we start talking about NEP Australia and you look at these vast distances, it becomes very challenging to adopt this. A second way to look at it is to say, okay, well, I'm going to do 2 GMs, 1 GM on red and 1 GM on blue, creating air gaps. Again, it's probably not a great way if you get drift or if your red and blue fabric starts moving around because the GMs are moving around. So kind of re-echoing what Gerard said, kind of the best way to approach this is to have a single GM at both sites locked to GPS, and then the fabric will move at the site by itself. And just to give you a couple of examples, there are different type of architectures where you have a boundary clock. So for example, here we can lock the Arista switches line card level with boundary switches, provide up to 400 slaves. If you want to use kind of ordinary clock, then put some Meinbergs in, let you scale it beyond that. Just keep adding more Meinbergs as you want to go. And again, if you want to do transparent clock, again, you need the Meinbergs because it'll make the run on the clocks. So there's lots of ways of deploying this. It's about making sure you deploy it correctly in order to provide the stability in your network. And this is where I would make sure you have the conversations with your P2P provider, your switch vendor, the type of devices that you're going to buy, because they also behave very differently. How do they behave to maybe P2P that's not so robust in the network? How do they fail over? Do they fail over by just lack of seeing a grandmaster on one network? Or does the device actually have a BCMA algorithm running so it can fail over based on clock class change? So timing considerations are, I think, very simple. Do you go with a single timing architecture? Is the jitter performance acceptable between remote links? How am I going to get PTP to black and burst? Is that possible? Do I need to do that? Why do I need to do that? What devices do I need to do that for? An air gap solution, what's the behavior of red and blue networks if you do this? Legacy timing, you'd be amazed how many devices that you may think are supporting PTP, but some of the devices do require black and burst as well. There are some production switches that use PTP to lock the media IOs, but then still use tri-level black and burst to actually do the crossbar or the ME inside of it. And that's really important to make sure then that your black and burst and your PTP are absolutely aligned, which is not always true of every grandmaster manufacturer. Boundary clock, in terms of scalability, numbers of PTP slaves. If you need to go beyond that, how are you going to manage that? And transparent clock, again, scalability and what's your GM architecture going to be? Is it going to be boundary switches above, or you can actually stick up some Meinbergs up above it as well and deal with that way? This one was alluded a little bit in Gerard's session. How do we manage the routes? So obviously the remote site, you have multicast traffic. Any device that's in that remote site can make an IGMP request for it. But by the nature of creating tie lines, just using standard network protocols like PIM or IGMP with equal cost multipath algorithms, hashing algorithms, is that you can end up with all the traffic just getting put on the one link. So as Joe alluded to, you can end up with 200 gig, all of a sudden just rounded up onto a 100 gig link. What does that look like? You get all these lovely gray lines on your receiving devices that's lost data as it flies through the network. So that's probably not a great way to move the data for a remote site or between blocking environments. So PIM in itself is not bandwidth aware, so it will just, if it gets a request, it'll just stitch the flow and pass it on, and then you'll then see all of the consequences thereafter. So there is an approach that you can have the devices, and this really approach depends whether you control the telco network. If it's your own network, you can put an SDN controller and control every switch in the network, and then just program the flows from its ingress to its egress port. But if it's a network where maybe you don't have control of the switches, and all you can do is provision multicast static groups based on source IPs, then you need to find some way to round the traffic up onto those. So in case this way, you can bring in 2110, we can NAT it, we can put it straight on. The NATing can be preloaded so certain multicast groups on certain links to provide collision of data, and therefore the traffic will fly through the network uncontended or without any packet loss. And in this case, it'll come out the other side, it's in the switch, any device at that side can make an IGMP request and get that content. So in this case, certainly with the NEP Australia guys, they wrote an interface to allow them to pre-program some of this static provisioning inside of the telco network to manage these links. So that works great where I've got a lot of bandwidth, 50 gig. What happens when I get a slightly smaller network? or I've only got a single link. Well, it's a similar process, but that IP processor that you're using for NATing or retiming, you may decide that you want to use it for compression. So I'm going to bring in 2110, maintaining everything as 2110 in that island, but I'm just going to quickly wrap it around, make it compressed, and maybe change the multicast addressing and shove it on the wire and send it out through the building. And again, likewise at this side, you don't want to burden all these devices with 2042 or VC2, so what you do is you bring it back, wrap it around, and get it back into the 2110 environment. So again, you could choose to put compression everywhere. It's really just about cost and choice, or you put compression where you need it and you limit the latency to where you need it. And again, pre-provisioning with IGMP locally. So just a couple of considerations at this point. Network switch topology, blocking, non-blocking, step-down switches, that was talked about a lot today. This is getting, how do I get my audio devices, which are also probably RJ45, and like your GMs, into a 100 gig, 40 gig switching fabric. There will be some need for a step-down switch. IGP performance, perfectly acceptable, great, very fast for local devices. There are some caveats. If I'm doing IGMP and PIM, and I have different VLANs inside of the same switch locally, that IGMP times will be slightly very different. And obviously, with PIM, you can run the risk that you've got oversubscription, or with IGMP as well. If the switch doesn't leave immediately, you can end up with oversubscription if you've got lots of random switching. Like I said, PIM in itself is a great mechanism of protocol for routing the multicast traffic, but it is not bandwidth aware. So it's, if my device, my sender, all of a sudden changes its input from SD to HD, PIM doesn't care about that. It's just routed the traffic. It thinks it's got the traffic. It'll move it on. The flows might have got bigger, and therefore you potentially could have broken the link. And again, the ECMP hashing is not deterministic. So whilst you can slightly over-provision for it, you could still run into these use cases where you build a blocking system. SDN control is very good for these types of topologies, timeline management, spine leaf switches, and the API performance is very good as you go down the stack. Again, we talked a little bit this morning about ISO 6. I think one of the reasons why ISO 6 hasn't been taken up is most of the control vendors have gone up to a lower level, which provides better level of performance, and I think that's one of the key drivers. But what do you do when part of that network that you've got to transit through, you can't control? So at that point, you've got to have a solution to be able to get your traffic through that. And again, the telco infrastructure, I think you will find it's mixed and matched. So does it support multicast? What's the jitter on it? What's the latency on it? What's the redundancy? And just simplest term of redundancy, you might find that they take diverse paths through countries, but then the last mile is them in the same trunk. It's not really redundant at that point. So control, the last sort of section, and I'll just touch briefly on this. Control is really where we take control of the system, we make it work and function, and this is the human abstraction layer. So this is probably one of the most important parts for all IP systems. We shouldn't burden the operators with having to relearn a control system because we changed the underlying technology that sits underneath it. And I think that's really important. It's one of the things that we have at Lawo, which is a key driver with the VSM. So there's one approach where I could just take the control system and put it across the entire lot. And we could build out clusters across the entire system to manage things like the audio and video routing, whether it's SDI devices or IP or a mixture of both, whether it's doing the audio routing inside the Nova cores, whether it's the audio routing to and from the audio devices, tally management, soft panels, hard panels. Whilst you can make the cluster redundancy, it doesn't really provide a configuration redundancy. So what they have at NEP is a slightly different approach where we break the thing down into more services and you basically put the services as and where required. So in the hubs, you have all of them and they share a cluster specifically for the audio routing because there's a lot of audio routing with a lot of channels that need to be managed. There's a dedicated cluster for that. This provides disaster recovery. So there's one config, master config. So Sydney can see Melbourne. The Melbourne devices are disabled. They can become enabled if they need to take over from it and vice versa. So it provides a disaster recovery strategy. It also means that the trucks, when connected, can also play as part of that facility. So you can take control of those trucks, manage the trucks. But most importantly, the trucks in themselves can operate in isolation. So one of the important things for NEP was that whilst the trucks are connected to the network, they have to be a participant of the network and the system, but they must also be able to go off and do their own jobs by themselves, so they have to have a control functionality in there as well. In terms of the operator experience, the kind of hardware and the user experience is abstracted. There are racks with hardware, physical hardware, and then there are logical devices that are presented to rooms. And the whole concept here is that any room can take control of any resource. So as Paul alluded to, if one production needs more EVSs, they can just assign more EVSs. They go to the touchscreen, they grab the EVSs, that resource is now assigned to that room for that production, and they use it. And then when they finish with it, it can be used by somebody else. So it means you can move the production teams around very efficiently. You can also utilize the resources very efficiently between sites. That's one of the big drivers with the hubs. And likewise, you can take control of the resources directly from the remote site. So it's just some of the consideration points here. It's very operational focused, so logical devices, physical rooms. The control system is both device and signal aware. When we talk signal aware, we're talking physical signal, and we're also talking flow aware. If it's a resilient architecture, you can choose to just go for a single control layer across everything. We probably wouldn't advise that, or you can distribute clusters with the right services required. Provides redundancy and disaster recovery. With 2110, every sender has to generate an SDP, a description of what it's transmitting. That in itself becomes a challenge of how do I get data from senders in remote sites back to the main site, so the receivers in the main site can then take that information and grab the flows. So we came up with a concept of what we call Ember Gateway, which allows the remote sites to essentially filter the amount of data it needs to send back to the main control system so you don't burden it with everything. So things like the SDP information and tally and so on. STPs are a mandatory part of 21.10.10, and you'd be amazed how many devices do 21.10 but don't actually do STPs. That's quite important. That becomes a problem then when I want to start to do routing and the receiver no longer knows the type of flow it's going to receive, frame size, frame rate, color space, what type of channels of audio, how many channels of audio it's going to get. So we end up having to do a lot of SDP patching, and that's one of the key features that we have in the VSM product. But it's not done. There are things that could be done. So this is not an NMOS deployment, but we do have LLDP, so we know where devices are on switches and stuff. And I think the ISO 4 and 5, very similar to the discussion on ISO 6, is still very much a work in progress. It's all about scalability, routing to layer 3, and then there are a lot of other things you want to do with a device that aren't accommodated in that protocol. So the routing between the devices, the parameter control of the devices. So I think that one is still a one to watch. And today, to the best of my knowledge, there still isn't a system of this scale delivered with ISO 4 or 5. So just kind of a couple of closing marks. This is really important to understand. It is a reality. We are no longer building boxes. These are systems. You have to treat them as systems. It's really important that you build partnerships. And not every vendor can do everything. That's a reality. And if they do, you probably lose the ability to negotiate or get them into a position where you can get the things you want on time. So I think building SDI facilities, they're well established. We know how to connect them, camera to a router to a multiviewer to an output. But in these systems, there are so many different permutations of the components. You've got to choose a pool of partners that you trust that can help you get through this and build out the systems. You can still build systems like this. It just may not meet the expectation that you started off with or the business cases that you want. And I think it's really important as an industry we build IP systems that are robust, resilient, and meet the expected customer requirements. So just a couple of points before I wrap up for questions. There are missing pieces. No IP system today, none of the ones I've ever worked on, are fully deployed and feature-enabled from day one. They do have outstanding development items or things that will come along that will change. In terms of the NP Australia, 21.10.40 is not part of that deployment currently. Arguably, you could say it doesn't need to be part of that type of deployment, but there are pockets of 2022-6 where you do need things like auxiliary data to be moved around. Maturity of standards within vendors, like I explained, I would say the core 21.10, Part 10, Part 20, Part 30, 31 to a certain level of degree are fairly well adopted between multiple vendors. Things like 40, even 21, the traffic shaping are coming online, but they're still taking a little bit of time. So you've got to consider what devices you choose. System enhancements, I think, will just change over time. We talked a little bit about device discovery, registration, connection management. There's a whole lot of things that were talked on in Gerald's session around DHCP, 802.x, quarantine of devices in the network, DNS, how we secure devices, how you have secure communication with devices, and what you do with devices that are not necessarily very well behaved in the network. And this will become more of a challenge as we branch out from the kind of traditional network. Flexibility and ongoing expansion, that's a given. Customers don't buy IP systems for it to just be that size from day one. They buy it because they're going to grow it over a considerable amount of time to either enhance either connectivity or increase capacity. And what you're really building is a format agnostic fabric. So the switch itself doesn't care about the video signals that go through it. It's just data going through it. And we see that with NEP Australia, as Paul mentioned. It started initially with SD and HD. And most recently, they've upgraded that to 2160, so UHD. And it was a very pain-free upgrade experience. And I think that will just continue changing over time. And the most important thing is it is proven technology now. I think there's enough large-scale deployments of this type of technology now to show you that if you do it right, it works. They are truly multi-vendor solutions. Like I said, there's very few solutions which are single vendor. There is a relatively high level of interoperability because certainly as a Lawo side, we don't ever make cameras or switches. We have no anticipation to make camera switches, so there's always going to be a requirement to have that integration with those devices. And these are not small systems. These are huge systems, as Paul alluded to in some of his slides. And on that note, I'll wrap it up.